We're delighted to welcome film director Lenny Abrahamson as the 2017 Humanitas Visiting Professor of Film and TV at Oxford, and to welcome the audience for this evening's lecture. The visiting professorship was established by the late George Weidenfeld, who contributed so much to the University of Oxford, and continues to be administered by the Weidenfeld-Hoffmann Trust. Its sponsor is Sean Woodward, who's here with us tonight, and whom we are extremely grateful for his ongoing support. Lenny Abrahamson is with us in Oxford this week. It's not a simulacrum. Lenny Abrahamson is in Oxford this week, and I know many people in the audience will have joined us for last night's film screening and discussion. There are also a number of film students here who had the opportunity for discussion with him at that event and at this morning's masterclass, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank him publicly for the inspiration, generosity, and encouragement he has shown. Lenny Abrahamson is among the most highly regarded and innovative directors working today. In addition to work for television and shorter film projects, he has directed 5 feature films. Garage, 2007, which was shown at last night's screening, was his second feature film, following on from Adam and Paul, 2004. His 3 subsequent films are What Richard Did, 2012, Frank, 2014, and Room, 2015, an adaptation of Emma Donohue's novel of that name. Film was an early passion for Lenny, but at university, which is Trinity College Dublin, he studied theoretical physics before moving to philosophy, winning a scholarship on graduation to pursue a doctorate in philosophy at Stanford University. Filmmaking proved, however, the stronger pull, and we might say that academic philosophy's loss has been the film world's gain. He'll be speaking this evening on naturalism, truthfulness, and the value of not knowing. Please join me in making him very welcome.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you all for coming. It's a very great honor to be here. Thank you to Sean Woodward for sponsoring this, much appreciated. There are some friends in the audience, and it's great to have them here as well. It's funny, it's been lovely to be here. They put me up in New College in very nice rooms and fed me and watered me very well, and I actually saw my first and possibly last ever port funicular yesterday in the common room in New College, which is a sort of a train arrangement that can carry the port around the table. I'm wondering how I survived to this age without having one, but I'll try and remedy that when I go home. So I wanted to thank Laura Marcus particularly, and Natalia Bulgakova from the Weidenfeld Trust, just for making me so welcome. Thank also New College. I started thinking about film and not just consuming it when I was in my late teens, and at that time the BBC, particularly BBC Two, used to show movies from the European canon late at night, and I remember watching Fellini and Bergman and Pasolini and films that I couldn't claim that I fully understood, and maybe don't fully understand now, but they made a huge impression on me and sort of told me that film was capable of a level of kind of intimate, subtle communication that I hadn't really understood before from the popular films that I had watched. And I had an inkling then that maybe it would be a good thing to make films. That would be an exciting and a fascinating way to explore ideas and to do all these, and to tell stories and to express fantasies. But fantasy is probably the operative word, because at that point, saying that you wanted to be a film director in the 1980s in Ireland was sort of a bit like saying you wanted to be an astronaut, or being 5 and saying you wanted to be a fireman. It was a fantastical notion and didn't seem very practicable, particularly because Ireland at that point in the 80s was a kind of wasteland of economic inactivity. There was lots of emigration, social stagnation, and next to no funding for the arts. It's something you guys better get used to post-Brexit. It's a pretty good description of where you're going to be. And I did very much enjoy, particularly philosophy was it was not a straightforward decision for me to leave philosophy and return to making films, because I did and still do have a great love of the subject, and it's a kind of slight joke for me for the title of this lecture is very pompous, and it's that sort of it's the structure of many philosophy books to have a couple of adjectives and a colon somewhere. But I did eventually make my way back to film via a brief period in postgrad studies and a long a phase of inactivity in bedsit land back in Dublin. And then I started to make things. I made commercials, I made shorts. I kind of dumped the youthful determination to hit the world with a complete and fully realized masterpiece, and decided that I really needed to start working on this thing and learning how to use this medium. And as Laura said, that led eventually in 2004, in collaboration with a wonderful writer and actor called Mark O'Halloran, who I also make Garage with, to Adam and Paul, which became something of a cult film in Ireland and travelled a bit, although the accents were so strong that it had to be subtitled in the States. And in other parts of it's a very strong Dublin accent. But yeah, followed by Garage and Richard and Frank, and most recently Room, which got a lot of attention and it, to an extent, certainly complicated life, but was very satisfying to see it received in the way that it was. And I think that and no more was maybe no more satisfying than this, to be asked to be a visiting professor at Oxford. I think the two things taken together may finally knock on the head my mother's repeated question of when I'm going to get a real job. I think she thinks this is okay if he's, if there's an Oscar thingy and then there's a bit of academic credibility, it mustn't be too bad. Now, because it's true, I'm sure that, painful as it is to admit, the chances are that not everybody in the room has seen all of the things that I've made. We thought that maybe the best thing to do leading into this, and let's see how long it takes to work the technology and stuff. I would show you a couple of scenes or a scene or so from each of the films and describe what they're about and what they're like, just in advance of talking about the themes that are alluded to in the title. So I'm going to start with Adam and Paul, which is a film it was a film that very self-consciously and irreverently kind of took a little bit of Beckett, a little bit of Joyce, and quite a lot of Laurel and Hardy, and told a story about two heroin addicts and their journey through the city over the course of a day. And it's a film about people with nothing to do and the ways it's like, one thing I loved about Laurel and Hardy was always that idea of them as two children, as a representation of adults as effectively like children, in that they're dwarfed by a world that they don't fully understand. And that's, I think, true of most of us, although some of us do a better job than they do at disguising that fact. So in the scene that you're going to see, going back a bit, at the opening of the film, the two boys wake up in the middle of a kind of wasteland in a sort of little Beckettian homage. One of them has been glued by somebody to a mattress in this field, and they have to drag him away and rip his coat away from the mattress. And in the process of doing that, the other guy, and you never really learn who's who, and that's kind of deliberate. It relates to the fact that they are kind of a symbiotic pair. They're referred to as Adam and Paul always, and never individually. The little guy notices that the jacket, the big guy's jacket, is made in Bulgaria, and notes that he feels sorry for them. Who, says the other guy? The Bulgarians. They have nothing, they do, he says. And this is these two guys who've woken up with nothing in the middle of nowhere. And then later on in the film, they, after a lot of misadventures, settle on a park bench with a man and get into conversation. So that's the bit I'm going to show you, if I can get it lined up. Actually, one thing about that scene is that the guy who plays the Bulgarian, who's so dismissive of the Romanians, is actually a former Romanian Minister for Culture. He was a guy who was a fascinating Romanian actor and activist at the time of the revolution, and he was in a play in Dublin, and we said, listen, we didn't even know whether to send him the script. We thought he'd be deeply insulted, but he agreed to do it. So that's a very routine. It's a sort of who's on first, these sort of Laurel and Hardy type thing, and the film plays with that, but it also goes into completely different tonal territory. I'm going to show you one other clip, and then I think I might talk a bit more before I show you others, just because this relates to what we're talking about. This is from the second film, which is Garage, and it is it's a film. The collaborator that I made Adam and Paul and Garage with, Mark O'Halloran, comes from a small place called Ennis in the west of Ireland, and like any small town, it's full of these very extraordinary characters, all of whom find a kind of niche in the town somehow. And there was a man who worked in Garage who was always super helpful, but who and was kind of hard to describe, but not quite, as other people. We tried never to kind of categorize or name the condition or to in any way medicalize it, but he's something sort of absent. And this guy in Mark's town showed a porn film at a certain point to a kid of about 15. And this guy was in his 40s. And there was no evidence that anything else happened other than that, but it was a deep humiliation for this guy, and he ended up drowning himself. And Mark and I had been talking about Ireland and about the narrative at the time that we were living through this amazing boom, the Celtic Tiger. This would have been 2007 or earlier when we were working on this. And it didn't seem to us that was touching the whole country. It was touching a very particular group. And so that coincided with that story, and we started thinking about what sort of a town that might be, and giving some dignity to that very complex and ultimately very tragic life. So I'm going to show you a clip, if I can find it. We've met Josie, who's the guy who runs this broken down garage. And he's sort of very proud of his work, very helpful to other people. And we've watched him go about his daily routine, which he tends to comment on as he goes. And this is the first time we've seen him at rest, and it's after his dinner. He lives in the back of the garage in a kind of makeshift room. Let me see. So that's Josie's life. He heads into a bar, and he we watch how he's treated by the rest of the people in the town, who he's sort of a joke for. And I want to just show you the end, which is a rather weird way to do this. And I'm not really sure how actually to do it, because it looks to me like I can't go further. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Right. Well, this is a really terrible way to watch a film. I might just highly recommend that you take the trouble to pay for a download from iTunes. So what I was going to say about, I didn't mention the horse. Should have mentioned the horse at the beginning. So one of the things he does is he passes this horse every day and feeds it a little bit, and sometimes talks to it. And so lots was made of that last image of the horse walking towards the camera and stopping and holding. And that's where I want to kind of start the substantive part of this talk. Because for most of Garage, we are allowed to see Josie as the rest of the town sees him, as a sort of, maybe not quite as nastily, but as a kind of ridiculous character. And in a way he is. I mean, he is a self-projecting person. He's a clown in the sense that he is performing all the time. He's performing for other people and for himself, and he validates himself by his rituals and by the belief that there's a kind of, confirming for himself that there's a value in these small improvements that he makes around the garage and in his general stewardship of the place. But I think by the end of the film, I hope that it becomes almost impossible for the audience to participate in that view of him. Like, the narratives around him and the stories about him and the ways in which you might construct him all seem inadequate, I would hope, to capture this person whose complexities are more apparent as the story goes on. And the idea of the horse, I suppose, and again, it's going to seem, if you don't know the film, it'll be very abstract and peculiar just to watch that ending. But the idea of the horse is very simple, I suppose. It's just, in one sense, in one straightforward sense, it's an image of freedom. The horse has been tied up in a field, and I don't know if the implication is that he's released it on his way to his final act or not. But for me, what's important is that encounter, and it really doesn't read there because it goes on a little bit longer, with the horse who, amazingly for us, just stopped in front of the camera and stared at it, having been led off up the path. And I said to the guys yesterday, I'd like to say it was because of, you know, a really extraordinary feeling that we'd created between us and the animal, but it was just because we'd given him a lot of apples and he saw us down the other end and thought, I know where I'm going. But nevertheless, what you get in the end is this encounter with an animal, and I'm very interested in animals and how we relate to them, because there is unmistakably a presence there. You know, I have dogs, I'm very fond of them, and there is an encounter when you have a relationship with an animal, and horses always have that effect on me. If you look into the eyes, there's nothing, I'm not trying to suggest any sort of you know, spiritual dimension, or I'm a complete materialist. What I mean is that there is some interior there, and we sense it, and yet it's very, very difficult with an animal like that to psychologize it. And the same is true of Josie, that our perception of his depth as the story goes on is not about, in the conventional Hollywood sense, you know, getting to know his backstory, why he is the way he is, what led him to this position. It's not about that at all. It's about encountering his presence and somehow recognizing the depth and profundity of that, and the fact that whatever stories we tell about other people, we can never completely capture them. And that's sort of my view of people generally, that they're both ridiculous and unfathomable. I feel that about myself even. And so to do justice to somebody, the aim of the film was to do justice to somebody as apparently shallow and limited as Josie. And all you can do is approach that interior like a mathematical limit. You can get closer and closer, but never really get there. And so we feel Josie's reality, even though we don't really know him any better at the end of the film than we do at the beginning. And there's a big distinction between this approach, and it is used by other filmmakers in some of the finest films. You know, I try, sometimes succeed, sometimes don't. But what distinguishes that approach to character from the Hollywood approach is that in Hollywood, screenwriters are required to, sort of beaten into submission to, reduce character to a set of psychological traits, to a kind of calculus of beliefs and desires, and usually to an absence or a lack which the film addresses through its plot. You know, the interaction of that set of character traits with an obstacle is what we call plot. But the problem with that is that it sort of creates a closed equation of a film. And life isn't closed, it leaks, you know, there is no conventional solution to the kind of conundrum of a person. So that idea of unknowability, sensing the presence and feeling the sort of reality of another person, but not trying to reduce them to a set of traits which can be manipulated for the purposes of the plot, that's something that I believe in strongly. And, you know, one of the things, in some of my films, less maybe self-consciously than in Garage, there are usually shots of nature and of the environment in which the characters find themselves. And that's an extension of this thought, which is to always, again, in a conventional film, everything must conform, must be doing a job in the moving forward of the plot and of course there is a requirement to maintain a kind of an intense engagement. That I do not abrogate that responsibility, but it is sometimes to remind people through these extraneous images that there is a kind of world with actual existential weight in which these characters operate, that not everything reduces to story and that calculus of character traits, that there is gravity in the world in which the story, and that there is a world which cares not at all for the characters about whom you're talking. For me, that's a deepening experience and not one which is extraneous. It's interesting that in Frank, and I don't know, some people may have seen it, the character played by Michael Fassbender spends all his time in this fake head in a big papier-mâché mask. And John, who is sort of roughly based on John Ronson, is a young wannabe composer who is fascinated and charmed by Frank and charmed by the mythology that he starts himself building up about Frank. And he spends much of his time asking people what he's like, or in fact, in his blogs, wondering, fantasizing about the backstory that might be there. And it's always a conventional backstory of terrible familial abuse, or, in various other drafts we had all sorts of picturesque ways in which Frank's deep troubles might have sexily and kind of, in a kind of nicely filmic way, have given rise to this peculiar behavior of covering his head up. And in fact, we learned something completely different, which is that he's just mentally ill. There's a strong connection to Daniel Johnston. If anyone knows the musician Daniel Johnston. It's a great documentary, The Devil and Daniel Johnston, in which he spends the whole documentary talking about the dreadfulness of his childhood. And then when you finally meet his parents, they're the sweetest, loveliest people who've just desperately been struggling with this boy. And John's character wants to believe that that in order to have a good story, there must be this kind of deep hidden secret. He's obsessed with that. And so Frank becomes a kind of commentary on that approach to filmmaking. It takes the piss out of that conventional approach to character. So the other thing about it is, I think, I'm talking about naturalism, it's a very difficult term in cinema, but with Josie, the fact that we can't quite grab a hold of him, for me, makes the film makes it more lifelike. It makes it feel more like a real thing. Because that is the condition in which we find ourselves all the time, which is that characters that we are with, even our close family, in fact, possibly especially our close family, are deeply elusive. And I remember somebody saying to me in the States, well, how can you, if we don't know who this guy is and where he comes from, how can he possibly be a real character? And I was saying, well, if you ever walk into a shop and buy a packet of cigarettes from somebody and have a 15-second conversation, then without knowing anything at all about where they come from, you still get a very, very distinctive flavor of that person. So that idea for me of character as presence is very important. And it makes it feel like it's out there. It causes the audience to lean in, to want to know, rather than to be spoon-fed a series of easily decoded cliches. Now, what I might do, just because it's fun, is show you a tiny clip of Frank, for those of you who haven't seen it, if I can make it play while I'm talking about it. Eek. On the RTE Late Late Show, there used to be somebody called Colette, who Gay Byrne would say, "Roll it, Colette," and then the clip would come up. I would like Colette to be here now. Okay, let me... So, what I can tell you about Frank is that John gets, by various means, connected to this crazy band. He wants to be a songwriter, he's not very good at it. He joins a band who are on their way to Ireland, to a house in the middle of nowhere, to record an album. It's kind of ripped off heavily from Captain Beefheart's book about recording one of their famous albums where they all went crazy in the woods. And this is the first time that John and Frank have been alone, and John is very keen to ask some questions about why he wears this mask. The only thing you need to know as backstory is this reference to a mannequin and to a person that isn't named. And this is another member of the band who we know has some kind of strange obsession with mannequins, some sexual obsession with mannequins, and who the night before tried to drown himself. So here we go, if I can find it. So yes, they go on to make him play his excruciatingly bad songs. So, you know, one of the, apart from the perversion of putting Michael Fassbender under a head for 95% of the film, it was it is a sort of, there are other ways in which I think Frank deals with some of those same questions of character in a more explicit way. So in a way I feel that like the first three films, and I won't play what Richard did or we won't get through everything, but the first three films are films in which you know the characters in the conventional sense of knowing about. You know them less at the end of the film than you do at the beginning. But I think you are connected to them in some other way that is very tangible. So I want to talk a little bit about other ways in which uncertainty and not knowing as stances, because of course films involve a tremendous amount of pre-planning. You have to set things up. It's not, of course, true that you can just approach them in an entirely naive way, but there are ways for me, stances for me in the making of a film, which kind of partake of something of that attitude of uncertainty that seems to me very important to my process. So let's talk about the process of shooting and how those things play out. So when I started making films, shorts and eventually commercials and all that sort of stuff, at the beginning I felt that I had to know absolutely everything, and there is a way in which as a director you need to have a very good grasp of the essence of a project, because the main experience of directing a film is having people ask you questions every 10 seconds. You know, you walk on set and people come over with a sample of fabric or a question about where a prop goes, or a discussion about whether you will need a certain person to be available the next day, and so you're always answering questions. But there is a difference between this kind of deep feel and the having of a completely spelled out blueprint. And at the beginning I used to feel that I had to have like a kind of complete storyboard of what I was going to do and an absolute plan for the day. And so I would walk onto set and immediately start saying, okay, so this is what's going to, because you're terrified that you're going to look like you don't know what you're doing. So you'd walk on and say, right, to the actors, you know, you're going to start over here, you'll come in here, this is where the main part of the scene plays out, start talking to the DP at the same time about how you're going to shoot it, and that's all fine, except you are missing a huge opportunity, because particularly with the actors, but with the crew as well, there is a load of stuff that they're going to bring with them, and then a feel for their role, a set of things that they've been playing with. And if you crush that with your instructions, then it's very easy for the whole thing to become a kind of puppet show, where people are acting out the plan that you have over-specified for them. And what I learned over the years is to mostly shut up at the beginning of the process, to in fact affect a kind of a presence of real uncertainty. So walk in, mumble a few words about maybe getting started and having a look at the scene, do the minimum instructing when it comes to where people should start. Oh, we'll start anywhere, like, oh, over there if you want, or whatever. And when that happens, two things occur. First of all, as you work your way towards the scene, which may or may not end up like the version that you walked in with in your head. If you're lucky, you'll discover something very different. If you're lucky, you'll notice something that an actor is doing and go, that's what I need to concentrate on. That's in fact the point of the scene. And you are learning something from the actual material in front of you instead of directing some idealized version of the scene in your head. And not only that, when you do finally get to the version of the scene that you want to shoot, the actors will feel that they have participated in making it. And that sense of kind of ownership, of joint ownership, becomes really important. So that stance of uncertainty is half true, because I really do want to see what happens. I really do want to remain open to what is going to occur in the room. And it's half a strategy, because it allows the actors to feel the ownership of the piece. And the strange thing is that, so then let's say you've got to that point then where the scene is beginning to feel real and it's beginning to feel fixed. And then you start having to decide how you're going to shoot it, because you again have many plans and ideas, and you've had long conversations with all the key creative partners in it, and you've you've got a series of film references and images and all these things which are floating, but I at least try to stop them from becoming fixed. And then I start to work the scene in, technically, how we're going to cover it. And in that regard, first of all, you must remain open to ideas that other people come with. And sometimes they're superb, and sometimes they come from somebody that you have no expectation of. And I always allow on set that level of involvement. And the people that I work with know when it's appropriate and know when it isn't, because sometimes in the middle of very intense work, you don't want the grip piping up. Wouldn't it be a good idea if we did it from over there? That might not be helpful, but there are times when you open the floor to that discussion, and it's really good. But as you start to work out how you're going to cover the scene, and you're open to those suggestions, what I try to do all the time, well, I usually work in a way where I am slightly behind the action. What do I mean by that? I mean, the difference between the implied, of course, the film director knows what's going to happen because you've already made the decision, but the implied author of the piece to be a little bit behind. So the camera responds to the action after the action happens. The camera doesn't anticipate. The camera isn't always at the place that isn't in the ideal place. Sometimes you deliberately take an angle which gives less away, which is like a 3/4 back shot, which is across the face where you can't quite see the expression, because what that does is it puts you in the position of a person in the room who is not privileged to get a completely perfect view all the time. Now, it's not. It is, each shot is calculated. So in fact, I am doing what all filmmakers are doing, which is deciding on the flow of information to the person who's watching. But I'm not doing it in such a way that they know it's being done. In other words, it feels like they need to work. And that sense of work is something that creates a kind of involvement that isn't there. Now, there are brilliant ways of working which are very different. There's, if you're Wes Anderson and you present these beautifully balanced images, that's a different, it's a kind of impresario approach to filmmaking. And I like much of that stuff. But the things that I'm most drawn to are the ones where the filmmaker appears to disappear, or seems to disappear, and seems to be hunting for something that they don't quite understand. So again, that sense of uncertainty and not fully knowing what's happening. So an intelligent, attentive person who is at the same time struggling to understand the meanings of these people and of what's going on. Now, the other thing about shooting films is things are never as you anticipate. So when you arrive somewhere and the weather changes or the location doesn't work, generally speaking, not being too attached to one version of the expression of that piece is a pretty practical thing to do. So when the scene is blocked, in other words, we know what people are doing and we know how we're filming it, what do I do when the camera's turning over? And this is, for me, the most important bit, and it's the bit that I've developed as I've gone on more and more. The director is in the privileged position of being the only person present when you're really shooting who has absolutely nothing to do. So, the person recording sound is really monitoring what's going on, has a lot of technical work to do. The director of photography is constantly watching what's going on. Everybody, the grip knows at this moment at this line of dialogue, I've got to push from here to here. Everybody's doing that. The director has precisely nothing to do. And for me, the job of the director, and this is sort of at the heart of what I think filmmaking is, at least for me, the job of the director is just to be the human being in the room, just to be there, watching what people are doing and reacting to that as a person, not as a technician, not just as a person. Because what happens often, I've seen this all the time, and I've been the victim of this myself. If you approach it the other way, and if you're kind of box ticking and calculating and saying, yes, that's good, that will cut with that, if you do that, you start to lose a sense of whether what's happening in front of you is at all believable or real. And in fact, the person holding the boom is more likely to have a sense of whether what's happening is good or not than you are. Whereas if you switch it off and just be there, then amazing things happen, and you just know it's not right. You just immediately feel that is a big bump. It doesn't make sense. I don't understand it. And those responses are very real. Similarly, in an edit, when I'm editing, and maybe that takes 4 or 5 months, if you have, if you're lucky enough, you will have 2 or 3 watches of a cut that are watched as if you didn't know anything about it. And when you watch it like that, there is no doubt about your instincts. You're always right. You can feel when it's wrong. You can feel when it's slow. You're not going in there ready to experience it a certain way. That ability to cultivate a lack of knowledge in the scene of just watch what's happening, see if you believe it. It's funny when you look at, it's really interesting to me how when you go away from that approach, you kind of, at least I have no anchor anymore. I don't know if anything's good. In fact, you lose the ability to notice whether a person's behavior is remotely plausible or not. In a way that if you were standing on a bus, you'd go, that's weird. But when you're in the set, you're thinking, well, hang on, I wanted to stylize this. Maybe this is okay, And in fact, if you look at, I'm fascinated by bad acting. I'm really fascinated by bad acting. Because if you bring somebody in who can't act, okay, not only can they not do the thing you need them to do in the scene, they suddenly lose the ability to do anything, including scratch themselves or walk. And you'll notice that. You notice it because it's brilliant. They have to reach out for a cup, and you can see them thinking, right, it's cup time now, and I'm going to reach for it, and then I'm going to walk, and suddenly they're terribly self-conscious. And it's the same for a director. You lose the ability to just run your own machine and recognize other human behavior and see whether you believe it or not. So that, for me, is the sort of unknowing that I'm talking about. And I realize I'm getting perilously close to running out of time, so I'm just going to jump forward a little bit. Actors, and how do actors themselves, is there an analog in terms of what I'm talking about amongst actors who can act? And there is. You tend to find very crudely 2 types of actors: actors who pretend, and actors who build. So actors who just it's a very beautiful, sophisticated type of imitation, and then actors who feel and work from inside. I tend to prefer the pretenders and pretending gets a very bad name. But it's a very noble art form, and actually working from the outside in can lead to a more profound and less kind of rooted in psychology presence. And also the other thing about pretenders versus and the feelers. The pretenders will get to the feeling, they really do, but they do it a different way. The ones who use the method and really are attached to that sort of very intense model, that we fetishize a certain kind of actorly intensity. And for me, those actors can be there can be a heaviness and a rigidity and a sort of projection of meaning and presence, which is actually not there in life. I mean, I said to the guys earlier today, how often do you in your ordinary daily life find yourself eye to eye with another human being, intensely swapping lines? It doesn't happen. We operate mostly in a sort of haze of half presence, and most of our speech is unself-conscious. And so when actors ask you, what am I feeling? I usually say, well, I don't even know what I'm feeling now. How do I know what you're feeling there? How about we look at it as a series of actions and work it that way and see if that elicits anything? It's very funny because the intenders and the intense actors, I've had situations where an actor said to me, a very, very well-known one, said, I don't want to play it that way. I don't feel it. I just want to sit on the floor in this scene. And the implication was, if I feel it this intensely, it must be true. It's the immediate and sort of organic and valid thing to do. And for me, that's like saying, you're dancing Swan Lake, and the lead ballerina comes out and says, I want to play it like an antelope today because I feel it as an antelope. And there is a validity. I mean, that's perfectly valid. She may well feel that, and it would be a really truthful antelope, but we're all making the same thing, So I feel that the actors, the uncertain actors, the less intense ones, are often the ones who give you the most delicate performances. The best example of that, I mean, there are those who combine the two, who have a kind of nuclear reactor of method power in there, but it's so lightly owned that they can dip in and out of it. Best example of that I've ever worked with is Joan Allen in Room. She's, you'd know her from lots of things, including, Pam Landy in all the Bourne films, but she's a brilliant American actors. And with Joan, it's a bit like directing 101. You find yourself having conversations with her which are like the sort of Directing for Dummies book would suggest, or the child's idea of what how a director talks to an actor. You know, I would like you to do it a bit more like that. Okay. And then she turns around, walks out and does whatever extraordinary magic she does and comes back in, and it is absolutely felt. But then she pops right back out of it at the end of the scene, and she's ready to adjust it and again go find it and do what she does and bring it back in. The actors who have to stay in character, for me that's not a sign. I mean, some of them are brilliant, so whatever gets you there, but it isn't something to be celebrated. It's actually a pain in the ass. I used to joke about, like, you know, Daniel Day-Lewis in Lincoln. Apparently everybody on set, and you know, if you're sitting off set, had to address him as Mr. Lincoln or Mr. President, right? And now you know, this is being recorded. You know, he's a superb actor. But it did always strike me as strange that he wouldn't be sort of on his way home from set to his apartment in Manhattan going, my God, where did all these automobiles and strange moving lights come from, and what is that big screen in Times Square? You know, but yeah, so I like that. I like the uncertain actor as much as I like the uncertain director. I won't go on anymore because I know we're nearly out of time. Okay, I'll sort of try and wind up, and then we can open it up for questions. I talked a little bit about structure, about removing certainties about character, and that is something that I do in a number of films at the macro level of the film structure. Maybe I'll just talk a little bit about the next films that I'm going to make and how they might fit into the things that I'm talking about. So, probably the next film is a British film. Which I read a book years ago called The Little Stranger and tried to get the rights. It's a Sarah Waters novel. It's a Jamesian kind of ghost story, which is very beautiful and tricky to make. And so it's the next film, and Donal Gleeson, who plays John, is going to play Faraday, the lead of this. And we're still casting the female lead. And it's a film about a person who doesn't know themselves, really. It's in which the ghost story functions as a very lovely metaphor for a kind of destructive capacity that the character doesn't recognize in himself. It's a sort of Jekyll and Hyde story where Dr. Jekyll doesn't even know Mr. Hyde exists. And that's going to happen this summer. And then I want to talk for 1 minute about my absolute passion project, which I think with recent success becomes more possible. It becomes more of a possibility to make it. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the writer Gita Sarini. She wrote a book called Into That Darkness, which was a book about Franz Stangl, who was the commandant of Treblinka. And in the 70s, when he was brought back from Brazil, where he'd been living under his own name since the late 40s, he was put on trial. She covered the trial, and she interviewed him extensively afterwards because she felt there was something different in him than the other perpetrators that were put on trial at the same time. There was a certain kind of uneasiness with himself, a complexity to him that wasn't there in the others. And so what we have, and she also then interviewed his wife, his daughters, people who had worked with him in the camps, victims in the camps that had seen him and interacted with him. And so with Stangl, there's a record of his life, of the life of somebody at that nearness to the absolute horror of the Holocaust that is rare. And what's interesting also about Stangl is that he was not an ideologue. He was not didn't start off as particularly sympathetic to Nazi ideology. He was an Austrian who was a policeman before the Anschluss in Linz, and who happily arrested Nazis when they were illegal there, just as he happily arrested communists when they were illegal. And then his unit was incorporated into the SS. He was a good manager. He got a job running one of the euthanasia places in Vienna, in Hartheim. And he just gradually, those were the people who were then sent east to man the death camps. But just what's interesting about Stangl is you have a portrait of a person who is not a monster, but who became one. And became one because of the moral gradient that exists in any culture, whereby it is always easier to accommodate yourself to power than not. I mean, and that's something that I've always been fascinated with. I'm fascinated with it even in the film industry, where if you pitch an idea in the room, you can feel the temperature either rising or lowering. It lowers if it's a difficult film, it rises if it's an easy one. And after a while, it becomes kind of, you know, for your own self-interest and also for other people's approval. And people, you know, it's like a bed. If you go to sleep in a bed that is not completely straight, you will end up on that side. And we live in very much right-leaning times, and, you know, that line does shift in that way. And I think it's significant. The story of Stangl is significant because it's a person who is relatively limited, very ambitious, who accommodates himself to power and ends up in this position. But the relevance of that to what I'm talking about now is that Stangl, I want to tell the story from his point of view. And that's, for me, the hardest thing, but also the most important thing. Try to make it difficult for an audience watching the film to believe that they necessarily would have done something different at the moment of these key decisions that he made. Because in fact, key decisions don't come announced as key decisions. And heroes don't look like heroes. They look like annoying, you know, if you look at the people who resisted in Stangl's circle, they would have seemed like annoying, dangerous, mithering people to be around. And the people who accommodated would have seemed like the strong ones. So the moral signposts aren't there in a life. And it's trying to locate myself, to unmoor the viewer from those ways of locating yourself morally, politically, psychologically, and just go with his life in a very first-person way and bring them to that point where it becomes apparent what it's, you know, how somebody who shares so much with us is capable of doing what he does. So it's the concept for me is one of a kind of the uncertain, the unknowing, the dealing with presence rather than psychology. For me, there's a humility in that attitude as a person who makes things, and that is deeply connected with a certain empathy, a feeling of empathy, which is the most important thing for me. I mean, rationality and empathy are the only things that stop absolute, you know, sort of catastrophe socially. And they're both in short supply at the moment. But I feel that I have to take the same approach to Stangl as a character as I do to Josie or anybody else, and try to understand him and actually use that capacity of the audience to empathize to do something quite radical to them as they find themselves going down this road with him. Yeah, so does anybody have any questions? Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much for the talk. It might seem like quite a trivial question. I wanted to ask if food had some kind of important role in your films, because you showed 2 clips of those, the baguette and the horrible steak.
That's a good. That's.
And the story Frank that he uses for the.
There are no, but I'll have a think about that. There's a great. I don't know who said that line. I don't know what I think until I've said it. So now that I know what I said, I'll have a look back and see if there's. There's a great bit in Garage where the Fanta's about to overflow and he sticks his finger into it. That's one of my But it's, glasses of water and beaches and benches seem to feature quite a lot.
Hi, thank you. You talked a lot about not knowing, and I'm an aspiring screenwriter, and I find whenever I sit down to work, I'm essentially wrestling with myself. I think, am I good enough to do this?
Mm-hmm.
And, I was just wondering if you wrestle with that, and whether you still wrestle with that today, because it sounds like you almost get a pleasure from not knowing.
It's a good question. It's not the same. There's a productive version of. I mean, the not knowing part is really a kind of. It's a nice phrase for the title, but yeah, there's a productive sort of way in which I sidle up to things, and try not to come with a ready-made plan. And in that sense, yes, I think screenwriting is particularly difficult because you have no material to work with. I mean, at least I get to throw the actors onto the floor and I can watch them and react to it. And there's a sort of, you know, Pollock's thing of throwing paint, right? I think the method there was just the accidents allowed him to sort of, you know, they shook him out of whatever he was trying to do and just suggested other patterns. It's very difficult as a screenwriter. I mean, one of the, something I've talked about recently, I'm really interested in the novelist Henry Green, mid-century, mid-20th century British novelist. And he does this extraordinary thing where he tries to absent himself from the description. So it's very dialogue heavy, but he creates this extraordinary sense of depth at the same time. And he always does this thing he never says he was angry, he says he seemed to be angry, or never says he hesitated, he always says he seemed to hesitate. And that does something in the literary form that the types of things I'm talking about can do visually. As a screenwriter, I think it's extremely difficult. I think the thing to do is to cultivate the ear that lets you hear snippets of, and that is a kind of, I mean, it's a projection, it's a sort of ventriloquism, but the screenwriters that I think work best are the ones who just have a sound of that character, put them in rooms with other characters, start to feel where the tensions and the interesting sort of counterpoints are. But in terms of doubt, oh yeah, like absolutely. I don't know anybody. I joked earlier on. I mean, I said we're all full of terrible self-doubt. If you're absolutely certain of who you are probably Simon Callow. It's not Simon Callow, Simon Cowell, or Donald Trump, or something, or George Galloway, maybe. You know, and it's uncertainty, and you just have to go. You know, continuing to sit there and write is your greatest chance of getting through that.
On that theme, I wondered if you thought that maybe Shakespeare worked in that way. He used his actors, they contributed lines, and that's how he got so much done, you know. As well as managing the theatre and all the other things.
Any comparisons to Shakespeare are gratefully received. I'll take that one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I came to watch a film yesterday at my garage, and I had some questions which I couldn't ask because I couldn't attend the panel. So if you
Sure.
allow me, I will ask them. At first, I thought first question on this film was wondering if it was inspired slightly by plays of Martin McDonagh, because it had this sense of several objects and several people and simple situations. Second, I was wondering if you made a deliberate attempt to make it look like an amateur video, because to me it seemed that it somehow framed it not in a, like specifically not in a specialist,
Sure. Glossy way.
A major, like a mainstream film.
Yeah.
And the third thing I was wondering, because it was the movements of emotions of this character were so nuanced, maybe non-dramatical. So to me, the suicide was a bit of a surprise, and maybe the thing which didn't correspond with the genre of the film, because even when he is rejected by the girl, he says, "Oh, well, okay."
Sure.
So to me, like, I actually thought that he might go to find a new job somewhere, like to escape from this place, but not to.
Sure. So the three questions. The first one, I'm not a fan of the McDonaghs, Martin or John, because I find the kind of that Tarantino-esque kind of gloss on the sing, just for me it doesn't do anything. It's got that sort of black comedic quality, which I'm not a big fan of. So I can see that there are similarities in terms of the world that they're in, but like linguistically and I've never enjoyed those. So I don't see that as a I would rather say, rather than amateur video, I would say maybe unconventional aesthetically, but you know, it's it's certainly it's not a glossy film in the slightest. I mean, it's very, very simple and simply lit, but I would hope appropriately. In terms of the third question, I think the reason that Josie has to do what he did is just the sense that he no longer has a position in that town. He doesn't have a place that he has somehow transgressed, and whatever story that he tells himself about how he is valued is no longer tellable. So somehow he feels very tragically that the only way he can respond to that, he believes he's done something absolutely terrible in a way that isn't true with the girl. That's just rejection. Here he has, in his head, I suppose, done something dreadful to this kid. So his response is to do that. As I say, it's inspired by a case, but of course you have to make the argument on its own merits in the film you make. So it may work for some people, but not for others.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say about your point of not knowing. I've worked with many directors, and I would say there's a massive difference between a director who hasn't got a clue versus one not knowing, and it's something that I really, really enjoy in filmmaking. I work in camera, and it's not much fun for me to not know.
Yes.
So some directors have made me stand in a room, not been able to see the rehearsal, and then the actors will walk in.
And they say,
no idea
follow them. Yeah. No, I never do that. I promise you that if we ever work together, I will never do that.
It's the nervousness of my performance in camera, working with them, was their favourite take of the film, even though I found it excruciating.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, of course, I would never describe myself in a pitch meeting or anything as I'd never use the term not knowing, because of course the directorial, like the absolute no-no is to not be able to answer the question. So of course, when I'm there, it's all very controlled, and we always make our days, and I work really closely with operators, particularly. I just worked with a guy called Will Bates, who's a fabulous guy, and it was just a great collaboration. You start to get into a groove with the person. I suppose what I mean, the not knowing is a provocative way of saying about remaining open, watching what's happening, not being rigid, listening to people, listening to actors, and working within. Of course, I don't arrive and then go, you know what, I didn't realize it, but it should be Steadicam and it's never been ordered. It's not that level. But yeah, because the crew have to trust you. In fact, they have to be able to do it the way I'm talking about, they have to really trust you. They have to like it when you go, you know what, this isn't working, and here's why, because then everybody gets a bit energized. If they can also feel that that's not right and this is better, So yeah, it's a kind of strategic and fairly controlled fluidity.
So lastly then, on something like Room, which we can see a clip of this evening, you're in one set.
Yeah, for half the movie, for an hour. Yeah.
For an hour of the movie. How did you save your angles?
Yeah.
I mean, you have to.
Yeah, it was a nightmare. But yeah, how do you stop it getting boring?
How do you stop it being repetitive?
Okay, here's what we did. This was really interesting, and I was working with Danny Cohen and Ethan Tobin. So Danny is the DOP and Ethan was the designer. And very cleverly, months before we shot, we got some flats, some lenses, some viewfinders, and we created rooms of different sizes. We originally thought we cannot stick to the dimensions of this as specified in the novel. It will be too small. It was 11 by 10 or something. So we said, well, obviously that's not going to work. I mean, you can't, how on earth could you shoot an hour in there? Because we didn't cheat. The lens, the plane of focus is always inside the room. We did allow the body to be outside the room, but we never, your eye, were you a pin-sized person, you could get the view that we got. And what we discovered was actually The double-sized room there was no drama, there was nothing, there was just this kind of dead open space. Started to shrink it until we arrived at pretty much, although slightly longer and slightly narrower, pretty much exactly the dimensions of the room in the novel. And what was amazing, and this is to a really experienced DP and designer and me, you're going, you know what, the story is so compelling that if you forget about, well, hang on, we can't come around here. If you are led by what's occurring between those two people, and you're clever, because you do have to save your wides for when you really, really need them if you're going to have a high wide. You do have to kind of... but actually, I felt we would run out of room. But by the end of the shooting, we shot there for nearly 5 weeks. I mean, we all had cabin fever, but apart from that, I sort of felt like we hadn't actually shot the place completely. Because like the boy, you start to notice more and more detail. You start to become... And one of the things about Room, which is kind of funny, was in the same way that the characters in the story have become so kind of used to it that actually, despite Ma wanting desperately to leave it, she is totally lost when she comes out. Having been in there for 5 weeks sweating it out with like loads of crew and everybody and a small boy and, you know, going to the same set every day and going back in and working. I used to hide in the bath a lot. I was quite often in the bath with a little monitor, and then I'd pop up at the end of the take to give. It was very uncomfortable. We were all dying to get out. We all thought, oh my God, yes, next week we're out in the world again. We can have wide shots. We can, you know, it's wonderful. And we were all sort of traumatized when we got out because we got so used to it. We were going, oh, there's traffic and the weather's really bad, and there are people passing by and there's noise and we can't control it. So we all went through a kind of mini version of the experience of the characters.
I think we could remain in this room, we could be held in this room by then for much longer, but we must call it a halt now, and there is a reception now, which I think people could stay for. But I have an utterly compelling